Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to welcome each of you to the first Center for Teaching and Learning and HHMI Inclusive Excellent Grant Speaker Series. So today we have with us Dr. Cynthia Ganote. But before we begin and before I introduce Cynthia, I want to recognize the land on which we gather today. Both the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University occupy the original homelands of the Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. We honor, respect, and acknowledge the indigenous people forcibly removed from this territory whose connection remains today. St. Benedict's Monastery and St. John's Abbey previously operated boarding schools for Native children. Now students, faculty, and staff are working to repair relationships with our Native Nation neighbors. Dr. Cynthia Ganote has been teaching classes on race, class, and gender inequalities at the university level for 25 years, starting at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and then St. Mary's College of California in the Bay Area, and now at the University of Louisville, which is back in her hometown in Kentucky. Over her career, she has served as a tenured sociology professor, a director of faculty development, an assistant dean for diversity and community engagement, and most recently, a consultant on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for organizations across the U.S. Cynthia's most recent writing can be found in the 2021 book, Equity and Inclusion in Higher Education, Strategies for Teaching, and also in a book we just got as an ebook in the library that we're hoping to do a series on in the spring on unraveling faculty burnout. And so she's publication in there. And just some final announcements. There's a QR code on the tables. We're just asking you to register your event so we can send you a survey and solicit feedback. And also there is a inclusive excellence or inclusive teaching certificates that is under development. And so we'll record your attendance for that. There's also 2 different versions of Save the Dates for exciting upcoming events in the same series. Next week, Dr. Carolyn Roberts will offer a virtual lecture on the historical roots of racism and colonialism in science and medicine. And then the following week on the Thursday, October 13th, Dr. Roberts will offer a follow-up Zoom workshop on inclusive pedagogy for STEM excellence. And so there will be information on that forthcoming, and we encourage you to invite your students to her lecture. It'll be a webinar format and students can attend as well. And then there's a second Save the Date on there, hot off the presses. Dr. Rayma Hart will be here October 12th, 26th, and November 16th. It's a 3-part inclusive teaching series on growing equity and valuing difference. And this is geared towards faculty in business and affiliated fields such as economics, sociology, psychology, and communication, but open to all instructors. And there will be more information on that forthcoming as well. So without further ado, I will welcome Cynthia. Give her clicker here and her warm Minnesota welcome.
Thanks so much to each of you for spending a 4:30 p.m. time together with me and with Laura and in community. I know what all it takes to, in week 5, at the end of a long day, drag yourself in somewhere and go, I'm gonna actually sit and listen to a speaker / interact. So it is a very big deal and I thank you for that. Really wanna thank Laura for inviting me and for all the incredible work she's doing. And so I'm just really delighted to be able to be here with you all today. Let me first say that all of my work is done 100% collaboratively with my colleagues. We all do microresistance research and teaching and then workshops like this. Floyd Chung is the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Smith College, and Tasha Souza is the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs at Cal State University Sacramento, also known as Sac State. So I just want to bring them into the room with us and acknowledge their incredible work, that they are standing here in spirit with us. I also want to say, as a sociologist, as Laura said, been a sociology professor for a long time, doing race, class, gender, and sexualities research, teaching, and service. And so here's some assumptions that I make from a sociological perspective. One is simply that we live in a society in which intersecting systems of oppression, for example, systemic racism and white supremacy, patriarchy, class exploitation, heterosexism, ableism, rankism, and others are still pervasive. So I come from that assumption. We haven't conquered a single one of those, that those systems are still alive and well both in the US and across the globe. And that, though I think we so often in higher ed wish that we were beyond these kinds of systems, that we're not immune. We frankly are, in higher ed, I believe, a microcosm of the broader world. And so those are the kinds of assumptions that I make in starting this work. I want to put the asterisk by rankism because that may or may not be something you've heard before. So I want to define that term. Rankism is, according to Fuller, an assertion of superiority based on rank. Not people are in different roles and in different places in the hierarchy, but an assertion of superiority and inferiority based on rank, and also the exploitation or humiliation of those with less power or lower status. So that's what I'm talking about when I mention rankism as one of the potential intersecting systems of oppression that we're working with in the background as we talk about microaggressions. So then the implication is that with all of these intersectional systems of oppression operating, there are things we can do to create active inclusion, and there are things we can avoid doing or think about before we say that can truly make a deep impact on colleagues, students, whether or not someone in any kind of role feels that our campus, this campus, can be a space where they feel included, a space where they belong, a space where they want to stay. There's a lot of research by, we're going to talk in just one second about Daryl Wayne Sue's work on microaggressions. He's arguably the top microaggressions researcher in the US. He and a colleague named Kevin Nadal have a lot of research about the detrimental impacts of microaggressions, and particularly cumulative microaggressions that occur for in this particular case, as we're talking about classrooms, labs, and studio spaces. For this purpose, we're talking about students so students of color, members of the LGBTQ plus community, students who are neurodivergent, students who, women students who are come from more impoverished backgrounds, first-gen students. So the kinds of students who are more likely to receive microaggression after microaggression, the research is so clear about the detrimental impacts. I have some citations at the end of these slides, but I didn't want to take that upfront time because I want us to be able to get to microaggressions awareness for a little bit and then really spend our key time on microresistance. But I do want to let you know that there's a lot about how whether students persist in a degree or not, whether students end up changing majors or not, whether students feel that that university education in general is something that is for them, or a place where they belong. So microaggressions are so important that I'm so thankful each of you came today to be able to talk about this and try to figure out some things we can do about them. So one of the things that I know for sure is absolutely there is no person who is perfect in their language, their body language, their emails, their anything, right? I don't know a perfect person. So the assumption I make is that each of us, I'm assuming like every other faculty I've spoken with, I'm assuming there are folks who are really, really familiar with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging work, and there are others that are newer to it, and then there are others that are going, I think I want to know what this is, and so I would assume we have folks at all different spaces in the room. I truly think every single one of us, I posit this at least for your perusal, I think each of us has something we can know more about, an area where we go, you know, I know a lot about gender, but honestly, I'm not as informed about students who are neurodivergent or who have any sort of disability. Or, wow, I'm really more conversant about students in the LGBTQ community, but I'm really not so great about students who are first-gen college students, or whatever it is. So I'm positing we all have something new to learn, and then in community, we can best practice with each other, because it is an ongoing learning process. Here's something I learned with faculty. I mean, I am one, so I know this well. I think so often as faculty, we spend our whole lives becoming expert at something, and so much of this work is about changing language in different realms and things that we don't know for sure. We don't know how a colleague would like to be addressed, or we don't know that we're just completely up on X issue. I think for some faculty, maybe many, I don't know, it feels weird to go, I'm in a space of not knowing, and I'm in a space of saying I have a lot to learn. I am assuming that for staff members, there are, again, both faculty and staff, folks that are at all different spaces with this. But I would ask each person, including myself, to start to be okay, or try to take a step towards being okay with not knowing and with being even uncomfortable. Because sometimes, I mean, I hope what we do today isn't particularly uncomfortable. I mean, no one through a microaggression that I know of. But what I would hope is that we're just able to practice with each other and go, nobody's perfect, so let's just do some practice today. So those are the kinds of background things I wanted to share with you all. Now, one of the things we can do is get really better versed on types of microaggressions and what they are. And so the argument here is that microaggressions are the everyday kind of commonplace manifestations of systems of oppression, so that when someone throws a microaggression around gender or race or class or sexualities or disability or nation of origin, that's a kind of everyday conversational way that systemic racism has that, or patriarchy or class exploitation or those kinds of things. So let's, for that reason, just get on the same page about what microaggressions are. I feel like that's a word that's probably any number of you may have heard, but I'm a social scientist, I want to concretize it. I want us to be able to all be on the same page. So I'm going to go through each of these pieces in turn. I'm going to ask you all for one or two examples of each type, okay? So Sue says, microaggressions are brief and commonplace, daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to the target person or group. So let's take that apart and say what that really means piece by piece then. Brief and commonplace means these kinds of things happen in the classroom, in the lab, in the hall, in the dining room, as someone is exchanging a conversation as they park in the morning. They can happen anywhere. They can happen in the residence halls, in the financial aid office. They can happen any space where people just start interacting. So they're everyday and commonplace, but they have a potentially really negative, really difficult impact on folks. Let me have to the next part. There's the intentional or unintentional. Person may intend it. They may absolutely not intend it at all. They may have the best of intentions. It's still called a microaggression if it communicates a hostile, derogatory, or negative slight or insult to the targeted person or group. So, I'm going to ask you all to give me one or two examples of the verbal, behavioral, or environmental microaggressions, okay? So I think, my assumption is most people are more familiar with the verbal microaggression. Words people actually say or write, a message that communicates hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to some targeted person or group. Would anyone be willing to share an example of a verbal microaggression? Would you say your name, please?
Hi, I'm Annette.
Hi, Annette. Thank you so much.
Happy to share. Where are you really from?
Where are you really from? Annette, thank you for that. Would you mind to share? So let me say that every microaggression has an assumption underneath it. Would you mind to make really clear, what's that assumption that comes from them? Well, where are you really from?
I think they're trying to figure out the ethnicity of that person.
Right. That's right. And so I had, as Laura said, I was out in the Bay Area at St. Mary's College of California is where I did the biggest part of my career. My students were incredibly diverse, just most often from California or the neighboring states, but very, very, very many different racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so this exchange would happen a lot. Where are you from? Sacramento. No, where are you from? They're like, Sacramento. I don't know how to tell you in a different way. It's getting it. No, you're not from here. Because guess what? I don't get that as a white woman, right? I mean, someone might say, like, what state do you live in? Nobody is giving that to me, right? So thank you so much, Annette. I think I saw another hand over here. Are you sure? Okay, somebody else have just another example of a verbal microaggression. We're just raising collective awareness at this point. These are the kinds of verbal things people might say.
Saying to my Chinese student, what are you eating, dog?
Oh, wow. What are you eating, dog? Wow. And your name again? Jean. Jean. The assumptions behind that, like with Annette, I described. What are the assumptions underneath that?
You're eating my pet. I mean, you're so alien and other, and people like you are so alien and other that
Right.
a beloved member of my family you would go eat. But
Right.
outside of the realm of the human, I think.
Right. You're not like me. You're not like, I'm not dehumanize in such a way, because I heard this, I don't know anything about your country. Right? There's all of that. And tell me again. Jean, thank you so much. So these verbal microaggressions might be around any number of topics: race, class, gender, sexualities, disabilities, nation of origin, a lot of things. Let's go into behavioral, which is nonverbal. Okay? So let's talk for a minute about what might someone do, they don't have to say a word, to convey a hostile, derogatory, or negative slight or insult. Can somebody give me a couple of nonverbal, please, and your name? Karen.
So asking them to get in groups of 5 or 6, and they quickly make the groups, and the one person who is not white is not in the circle because they get very tight.
Yeah, absolutely. So who is excluded? The student of color, immediately. And no one said a word, and the message is very, very clear. Karen, thank you so much for that. It's a clear, nonverbal, Sue calls it behavioral microaggression. Can somebody offer another one? Anybody willing to share, please? Your name?
Erica.
Erica, thanks.
In biology classes, when nursing is the topic, addressing the female matching students, when
doctors at the topic addressing male action students.
Wow, and the ways in which you can tell with these, it may be intentional or unintentional, right? I mean, I assume unintentional until proven otherwise. That message is so clear, right? The women I'm looking at for nurses, the men I'm looking at for as doctors. Absolutely. So these kinds of examples are clear examples of nonverbal microaggressions. I've heard multiple times today examples of, on the bus is called The Link, yes? Is that right? On The Link, white students not being willing to sit by students of color, and that being a clear pattern that has made some students go, I don't get on The Link anymore, I drive every time I have to. I can't have that part of my day every single time. And of course, that's not to mention any later in the evening, kind of, when it gets a little party bus-ish. And do you know what I mean? And students sometimes literally not feeling safe on The Link. So I've heard a lot about the nonverbals, and verbal, can be verbals too, but nonverbal kind of microaggressions on Link and other core key transportation methods on campus, right, between the two campuses. So those are behavioral or nonverbal microaggressions. How about environmental microaggressions? The first time I heard this category, I thought, this is opening a new area for me. And so there may be more strains than this, but I think of there may be symbols in our environments that are up on, I don't know, a residence hall door or in a window or in somebody's office, and that communicates a hostile, derogatory, or negative slight or insult. Environmental microaggressions might also be about access. Who has access to our educational spaces and who doesn't? And I saw a hand. Who had, oh yes, please.
I'm not sure this is good enough to be a microaggression in terms of the brief or commonplace enough, but I'm thinking about during the pandemic when Mankato was trying to, University of Mankato, Minnesota, was trying to set up pods for students to study, and it was not wheelchair accessible, so students who fit under ADA could not, and then when they did set them up, they were set in very out of the way places that were not normal where people would go. Again, I don't know if it really fits under microaggressions.
You know what? And it's Kelly, right? Kelly, thank you so much for bringing that up. I mean, I think it is both. It manifests as a microaggression to that individual, and it's also a macro part of the structure that, again, likely unintended, but nonetheless, it's planned by somebody who wasn't thinking of students with mobility issues. Nonetheless, any number of students simply can't participate in that educational process, right? So thank you so much for that example. Other environmental examples of microaggressions that you all can think of, please, in your name. Emily.
The Crusader shield is part of our logo.
Oh, yes, I think I know, but would you mind to?
I actually don't know. I mean, this is not really my area of expertise, but my understanding is that the history of that is connected to the Crusaders, which, in particular to Muslim people who we were crusading against, might see that as a microaggression.
Thank you. I had not even processed that one. That one had not come to my consciousness. And there might be any number of symbols that maybe I don't know about as an able-bodied for now person, or as a white person, or do you know what I mean? And then a student or a colleague, staff or faculty member goes, guess what this says to me? Murdering of my people, elimination of my, and so thank you so much for that. There are all kinds of different microaggressions that you may or may not see a new, when you leave and think, oh wow, was that actually a microaggression? And of course, there will be folks in the room who are very, very familiar with all different types of microaggressions. Just again, we used to argue that these are microaggressions or micro-level manifestations of systemic racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, heterosexism, all those systems. I want to give another kind of 3 examples, and this is again just in awareness raising. So Sue talks about micro assaults. One might also, as Kelly did in her example, one might also ask if this is really micro, but this is, a micro assault is a conscious bias belief or attitude that's held by individuals and intentionally expressed or acted out overtly or covertly towards a marginalized person or socially devalued group. Now, what does that mean? That's when a person, they absolutely know, I'm not hiring a woman. I'm not hiring a woman. We're interviewing women. I'm not hiring a woman. And they act it out, maybe covertly, maybe they say it overtly to call, I don't know. Just a made up example. But the person is acting this out all the same. They know well, they know they hold it, it's intentional, and they're operating in that way. So that's a micro assault. I mean, it is, any number of these things are kind of, there's a continuum between micro and macro, right? And they're both pieces of it. So that's a micro assault. This is more likely the kind that folks would say, yeah, I mean, that's a microaggression, I mean, clearly. But others can be a little bit more slippery, but still harmful all the same. So micro insult is another type. A micro insult is a subtle snub, often unconsciously disguised as a compliment or a positive statement directed towards a targeted person or group. Often the person thinks they're giving a compliment, and they are not. Can anyone think of it, just to explicate that, can anybody give an example? Yes, please.
To people of color, you're so articulate.
Yeah, and just as I asked earlier for different folks to unpack, what's the assumption under that then?
The assumption is that they aren't articulate to begin with.
Right, because I don't get look of surprise, you're so articulate. I don't get that, right? And so it's an assumption about folks in that entire identity group, and you are, I'm quite surprised. So it comes off as a compliment, but it's actually deeply rooted in systemic racism, right? Those kinds of assumptions. So that's a micro insult. Here's one that I got a big light bulb moment on the first time I heard about it, and it's a micro invalidation. So let me explain this one. This is where the person directly attacks or denies the experiential realities of socially devalued groups. They accomplish this goal through interpersonal and environmental cues that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and experiences of the targeted group, okay? So would somebody help us explicate that one? What's an example of a micro-invalidation? Is anybody willing to share? Please, and your name again?
My name is Jake.
Jake, thank you.
I had a student one time who came to me and said, like, I think that this other professor doesn't want to shake my hand because I'm black. Not here. And I, so I think he was looking for someone to validate, do you think my perception is real or not?
Yeah.
And I could have said, like, no, you're crazy, like, that's not true, or
Right.
try to be supportive. So.
Absolutely. And do you know what? I love what you're highlighting there, Jake. The idea that I think so many folks with a really good intention hear that story and often go, oh, no, he's such a nice guy. Oh, no, oh, God, no. He's really fill in the blank. Don't. Implication, you're being too sensitive, that didn't happen, you must be a little bit crazy, or what, do you know what I mean? Whatever it is that makes the person feel off-center. that sort of thing. The idea then, the alternative is graceful listening, which is, I'm so sorry that happened. I mean, it sounds like a terrible experience, or what, whatever someone would say in their own language, right? And those kinds of microinvalidations, I truly think one might also call it gaslighting in common vernacular. And I realized how much in my early career I had received any number of, oh, no, you don't understand, this person is just whatever. It does make one feel, well, I mean, then what's the matter with me? Like I feel terrible is all I can tell you, and so it's that kind of example. So let me ask you this, would you be willing, you don't have to share this, but I'll ask for a few examples, would you be willing to just write for just a moment about what might stop you from intervening or responding to a microaggression before we get into the microresistance techniques, which I'll just take, I'm going to just put a minute on my timer here. Write it for yourself, you don't have to share it at all. Okay, so there's the timer, so finish up whatever sentence you're writing, or just thinking about. And is anyone willing to share? Imagine there are myriad reasons for why folks might be stopped from intervening. Please, in your name?
Shane.
Shane, yeah.
It's often a tense situation. I think there's often a desire, at least with me, to calm the situation down.
Right, absolutely. Shane, thank you for that. Others? Oh, yes, please.
There is a power dynamic in play, and I'm the person with less power, and I'm going to challenge the person who did their higher. And there will be repercussions of my position to be afterwards.
Absolutely. Can folks hear that? Everybody get good. I'm so glad. Absolutely. Power differential. You're the person with less power. It's your boss, your supervisor, it's somebody on the, whatever your promotion and tenure committee is called. It's someone who you feel, I'm not sure it's safe for me. Or it's someone who is doing performance evaluation. Absolutely. No, thank you, Teresa.
No, Heather.
Heather, I'm so sorry, Heather.
You'll be tested at the end.
Yes, of course I will. Okay, Shane.
I'm just going to admit that, I think it's hard for us to know what really happens to students.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Sure.
unless we are really connecting and hearing the student stories, I was going to say blindness. Blindness stops me from intervening unless I really sit there and say, this is the crap that they deal with.
Right.
On the bus, and I should care about what's happening on the bus, even though I'm a faculty member.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely.
Isn't that Res Life's job?
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. This idea of, I first hear you, and you tell me if I've gotten this right, I hear you talking about awareness, just simply awareness of, oh, wow, and thinking impact, oh, wow, that actually could be a really huge impact on my student or students, and then going, well, whose responsibility is that? I don't work in that arena, so that's somebody else. Absolutely. Thank you so much for vocalizing that. Anybody else, please, in your name?
Oh, Jennifer. I felt uncomfortable at times in terms of feeling like I'm the one who does have the power differential over the students. And so I just get nervous about how to say this in a way that will not be shaming. By saying, well, this could be viewed as a microaggression. It could be, and I try to mitigate that by talking about microaggressions at the beginning of the course, so that we can talk about what are they, and if someone does think that you committed a microaggression, then they're going to raise it, and then we can learn. And so I don't want anyone to feel shame, because microaggressions are usually unintentional. So I try to do that, but it still feels really uncomfortable in my gut to sometimes call things out.
Absolutely. Jennifer.
And they can be really subtle, you know, it's just really subtle about, well, the way that you know, it's not an insult, it's not about, but it's just something that.
Yeah, that you're like, my stomach feels really weird about it sometimes, right? Sometimes it's clearer, sometimes it takes a while to go, wait, what just happened? So absolutely, there are so many, I appreciate your mentioning potential shaming capability and just the power differential as well. You know, I want to say something building up on what Jennifer said. I have so many times so I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, so I was raised to be a very nice Southern girl. And so a nice Southern girl, I mean, you don't address anybody about they just said something, you know, that really hurt you or was really uncomfortable or made you feel like, oh my God. I don't think they know how much impact that language has or whatever else it is. And so I had to really wade through a kind of cultural thing that I grew up with and go, I'm not sure that I can be nice, because that's like, if it's what I grew up with, it's like you don't ever make anyone uncomfortable, ever. And I had to start going, well, I mean, I think I can be kind, or I can try my very best. I may or may not be called nice, and in fact, what I can't control is how the other person receives my message. It's the one thing. I can work on my language, I can practice different microresistance techniques, I can do all kinds of things, but the one thing I can't control is how that person responds or what they've been thinking. Like, I may not be the nice lady anymore, and that's okay. I face so many patriarchal kinds of microaggressions that I had to break through that, and I feel like sometimes there are different ones of us who have grown up in different cultural contexts that are more, let's just let that slide. And I'm actually, again, you receive this or don't, I'm calling all of us to take responsibility for the kinds of microaggressions that happen, and thinking of each of us trying to up our game a little bit in, maybe we weren't the one that was targeted, but we can be part of, oh wow, in this department, in this classroom, in this community, in these two campuses, this is how we try to treat each other, and so let's practice some things, right? I'm also I want to correct my own language earlier. I said something like, a microinvalidation can make someone feel crazy. I want to take that piece, I want to take that word and just lift it right back up and go, that's not actually what I mean. And I truly think there are ways in which, if we are open to going, you know what, there are different words that we've all used for all our lives, and now they have different kind of implications and impacts. So I want to lift my own word out and go, I need to think better of some alternatives, right? So my belief truly is vulnerability, in as much as it's safe for any one of us in different roles at St. Ben, St. John's, different kinds of contacts with those who have more power, less power, all these different things. What I know is, as staff and faculty, we have so much power compared to the students. And I want to share something let me first say this. I would never be the person saying, so now I expect everybody to intervene every single time. That would just not only be irresponsible, it would be unsafe in some situations. There are some situations that are quite literally life and death, how the person who's targeted responds. For example, a Black citizen on a police stop. We know the kinds of statistics about the danger that a person of that identity would have in those kinds of things, whereas, I'm gonna be real honest, I got a speeding ticket a couple of weeks ago. I did not have any fear. I did not want to pay that ticket, but I did not have any fear. It's a different kind of, entirely different kind of consumer. So I would never say, let's all micro-resist in every situation. Never. I also want to say that my communication scholar colleague Tasha Souza says, you know, when we're silent, everything speaks. So silence speaks as well. Silence is a really big message, right? So one of the arguments is if we, the folks in power, compared to the students and in all different kinds of power up and down relationships with each other, depending on context, if we don't speak, it may breed silence or more incivility. So I'll tell you what a student said to me at one point. One of my students at St. Mary's College of California said, kind of early in a class, from these weeks up to now, and you know, I understand y'all are in week 5, kind of in these early weeks preceding now, he said he would, if a student expressed a microaggression and the professor didn't say anything and kind of went back to, like, pretended like it didn't happen and just went back to this theory or whatever, the formula, whatever else it is, what my student said was, he said, then I know anything goes in that class, and I know I am not likely to feel safe in that space. He is both Latinx and in the LGBTQ community, and it is a kind of situation where I have often tried to say to myself, if I'm silent because I'm uncomfortable or I don't know the perfect thing to say, then who gets the message that they don't get, that the space doesn't get protected, right? And so I just want to add that in as something that my students' comment made a really big impact on me. I also had a student that I met here at St. Ben St. John's talk about having seen folks in authority not address a microaggression, how confusing that was, because the student said, I mean, that was the adult authority figure, and I don't know that they didn't say anything, so I was confused. You know what I mean? So it's the kind of thing where there's a real cost to remaining silent if it isn't a life or death situation, or it isn't a, I could, you know, it's not safe, or it's, sometimes it's I'm not sure I could retain my job. And those are, again, I would never say micro-resist in all situations, but that students' words have really impacted me on this topic and pushed me to get out of my own comfort zone. So how can we address the kind of microaggressions that occur in our classrooms, labs, studios, offices, community spaces? That is through something called microresistance. And so a woman named Sayumi Iray developed this term in her dissertation in 2013. And my colleagues, Wei-Chan, Tasha Souza, and I thought that was an incredible term and just expanded the conceptualization just a little bit. So we're calling microresistance small-scale individual or collaborative efforts to match the scale of a microaggression that happen in everyday interactive spaces. So these are small-scale individual or collaborative efforts that empower targeted people and allies, and explain asterisk what we mean by that in a second, to cope with, respond to, and or challenge microaggressions. So again, let's take that apart. They might be individual or collaborative efforts. Maybe I walk into a meeting and I know someone in my department always interrupts our staff member in the room in our department. And I want to make sure that they get to express their full point. Or maybe I go in with a colleague and we have a plan. We know this interruption has happened so many times, so I go, I'm gonna say, if it happens, I'm gonna say this, and will you that, you know. So sometimes it can be collaborative, sometimes it can be individual. It's just what, so many of these things are according to context, who you're comfortable with, what your personality is, what you think you could kind of push yourself to do. These tools just simply empower targeted people and allies. So they empower both those who are targeted by the microaggression and allies, and just again, define that one side. And it just allows people to either cope with, respond to, or challenge microaggressions. So these efforts, when we do simple micro-resistance, they do have a goal of disrupting systems of oppression as they unfold in everyday life, because systems of oppression depend on everybody else's silence. Systems of oppression deeply depend upon only the targeted person going, and everybody else being like, can I get smaller? And being totally silent. So micro-resistance, stated in a really, really diplomatic way, is still disrupting that silencing part of the system, and in a real grassroots way, with folks taking responsibility together, ideally leading to more inclusive institutions. At first, I think it leads to more inclusive spaces. You know, we in the sociology department are going to, Jake and I in the sociology department are going to, we're going to do some things. And I think it's a real ground up grassroots kind of effort. And make no mistake, these efforts are most powerful when paired with support from top leadership, right? You can have the ground up, powerful. When you have top down, that is much more powerful, right? And you can only imagine you could have top down, but if you don't have ground up, both really play a role. So I want to name that. So simply what we mean by the term allies when we say these are tools that both those who are targeted and allies can use. What we mean is allies commit themselves to ending systemic oppression by following the lead of targets and acting accordingly. So for example, I as a white woman in the Black Lives Matter movement want to, as someone who is committed to doing anything I can to try to end systemic racism and white supremacy, I am not gonna get in the middle of everything and start telling people what needs to be done, but instead follow the lead of those who are targeted by systemic racism and white supremacy and acting accordingly. Linking arms, being part of the solution, understanding I as a white woman do not have the daily experience that my colleagues of color have. So clearly this last point would avoid being a white savior or a performative ally. I imagine some of you will have heard both of these terms, maybe one or the other, but white savior is the white person who thinks they need to reach down and help those who are less fortunate instead of solidarity. Linking arms, going, I can be part of this. I want to be part of this. I am here to be in solidarity. I'm not trying to solve things for people. I am trying to link arms in solidarity. And a performative ally, I do not know how much this happens here, but this was a very, very Bay Area thing. This is the person who's like, I'm an ally. I'm an ally, I'm wearing an ally t-shirt, I'm an ally. And that person supposedly allied to are like, I've never seen any evidence of that. Not once, right? So that's the performative ally who's more interested in saying, I'm an ally to X community than just doing the work, showing up, building trust, listening, making mistakes, going back to say, I still want to be a part, we still have, and that kind of process. So that's what we mean by allies. Now, microresistance might honestly happen. You can do bolstering microresistance before microaggression ever occurs. You can do microresistance immediately after a microaggression has occurred, or you might do it after a microaggression has occurred and you've had some time to contemplate. You go home from a class and you think, I don't actually feel comfortable with how that went, but I didn't know what to say, and so I'm gonna address them in the next class. And I'm gonna say, you know what? I don't feel good about how that went, and I wanna have a conversation, or whatever it is that you do. So the microresistance might happen in any of these times. It's also, microresistance is not just a one-off response or reactive, I'm just reactive, but instead it's an intentional, constructive form of resistance that against the multiple forms of repression as they manifest in everyday life, so that we can begin to act into the inclusive environments that we really aspire to. It's a practice. It's something where everyone is learning. Obviously, I'm learning. Everyone's learning. I would argue there's not a perfect person. And I would argue when anyone brings a conversation to you, or I know I perceive it this way, anyone brings a conversation to me and says, you know what? Can we talk about something you said in the meeting? I want to tell you what the impact was. Whatever else they say, that is a gift. That is a gift to me. They trust me enough, actually, to think that I can learn and that I can change. So while it may be, there's a lot written about white fragility, these kinds of things, but I think almost anyone might initially have but I'm not a bad person. And I want to ask if anyone who has or will have in the future a kind of an immediate defensive response, if the capability to just kind of sit with it and go, can I just listen? Can I listen to this person's feedback and hear what the impact was on them? And wow, maybe I learned something new and I can practice. I can really try to not say that again or not do that, or I can really try to interact in a different way or notice when I'm interrupted or notice whatever it is. So I do want to posit that as a gift. People don't talk to folks they've written off. They just cut a really wide swath around them. Do you know what I mean? People do not bring to someone they do not trust, who they think is a lost cause, they do not bring a conversation like, let's sit down and talk. You know, both people know it's going to be uncomfortable, or lightly uncomfortable, or maybe a lot uncomfortable, but that it's repair work, it's educational work, it's community work, and it's a practice. So I want to pose it as that way. I want to ask you all, we're posing, my colleagues, Chung, Susan, and I are posing microresistance as this umbrella. And that there are all kinds of concrete forms it might take. So I'm going to present a few today and then have y'all practice. And so microaffirmation is one, something called OTFD is one, XYZ is one, something called AI is one, and you may have other ones you've used, you may have other ones that come up for you that you modify as you hear some of these. So this is meant to be food for thought, not perfect responses, but just practice that we all kind of dip our toes into. So one concrete form is a microaffirmation. So one named Mary Rowe came up with this term, microaffirmation. She talks about microaffirmations as tiny acts of opening doors to opportunity, gestures of inclusion and caring, and graceful acts of listening. So taking any of those pieces, I wonder if anyone has an example that they would be willing to share. This is not, employee of the year or student of the year or top student award. These are interactive, everyday interaction, kind of a door of opening a door to opportunity to a student or a colleague. Again, we're talking about students and classrooms here, but all these principles apply with colleagues and family members and community members as well. So a tiny act of opening a door to opportunity for a student, or a gesture of inclusion and caring, or a graceful act of listening. Can somebody come up with an example so we can really concretize this? What would an example of microaffirmation be? Yes, please, Amanda.
I don't know if you can put it in this category, but I just think about showing up for students. When they have an event, when they have something, just going, showing your face.
Absolutely, Amanda.
Yes.
I really want to get people's names, so I just, showing up for students. We all know, may I assume we're overworked and underpaid, exhausted, this far into the pandemic, really kind of at a state of mind, body, and spirit that is uncharted territory, perhaps. So I love that example, and I assume it must be used sparingly, but also, oh my gosh, it matters. When you're able to do that, you're able to show up for a student at their fill-in-the-blank theater performance, sporting event, debate, competition, right? Any of those things. Thank you so much for that. That's a great one. That's a great microaffirmation. Anybody else? Can you think of another example? Did I see another hand? Yes, please, Kelly. And then Matt. Well, we're going to go to both of you, so whichever person wants to go first. And that,
I was just thinking of Karen's example of all of the students forming groups and excluding that one student.
Yeah.
And maybe one of the students from the other groups actually being like, oh, join us.
Absolutely. All it takes is, oh my gosh, I don't think we've met. Hi, I'm Cynthia. Come over here. Oh my God, y'all bring a chair. I do that with adults a lot. I don't find in particular adults do that great a job sometimes of including other colleagues or strangers, or, do you know what I mean? A friend of mine quite seriously told me a couple of nights ago about going to a new group book club and having gotten there late, there was no room for her to sit and no one went, oh my gosh, here, scooch in, let's get a chair. Quickly, everybody, this is Joanne, nothing happened. It just didn't happen. So one person doing that is powerful. And did you want to say more about that?
No.
Did you? Oh, thank you so much, Annette. And Kelly?
Just thinking, listening to your students talk about the things that are important to them, and you can work in examples related to that in class. On PowerPoints or as you're talking, things that are specifically related to their interest in opening up a business, shoes and fashion, one of the guys in my class.
Absolutely.
And then talking about how you might run a campaign for that business.
Yes, absolutely. What we know from the research on teaching and learning is that relevance, when students can hang some kind of relevance to the material, it can be any material, but the kinds of examples that mean something to them and that are, that attempt to be across kind of a wide range too, So that is fantastic. I might also suggest just things like when you say to someone, you send them an email and go, thought of you when I saw this leadership opportunity. Don't know if you're interested, but thought of you immediately. Just that kind of sense. You think of somebody. Sometimes it's just saying out loud the things that you think about your colleagues that you really love about them. You're like, thank you so much. You always do this. I want to thank you. I think it in my head and I'm too rushy to say it, right? Those kinds of things happen, I think, all the time. That graceful acts of listening, that's back to Jake's original example of the student comes and says, had a really uncomfortable moment in class, and you offer a graceful act of listening, right? Instead of telling them, that didn't happen, instead just going, I've often, as a faculty member, I've often said, as long as I have this choice, at the end of listening, I'll say, if it's appropriate, do you want me to do anything about that? Or, and yeah, I've often had the students say, no, I just needed to tell somebody, I trust you, I needed to talk to somebody. Sometimes it's, I don't even know what I would do. If I wanted to do something, would I report this to the department chair? Or, they want to brainstorm sometimes. Sometimes they're like, please, I'm begging you, don't say a word, but I really needed to talk to you. And if you're not a mandated reporter for that issue. So those are microaffirmations. I would argue that they are things that whenever I receive one, I just think, thank you so much, that's so nice. You just kind of, it's, people doing what it is that they do and getting that affirmation from colleagues. Something we're going to practice now is something called OTFD. It's a little communication tool. It's another concrete form. So concrete forms of microresistance, we just did microaffirmation. And we're going to do OTFD. This is one, I like to think of a tool belt that I like to pull that one out when I'm really shocked and the cortisol goes flowing. So when I'm really like, did that just happen? Okay, it did. So this is an open the mnemonic, open the front door to communication. O is observe. This is where you just name what it is that you observed in concrete terms as much as you can. The T is the think step. Your thoughts based on the observations or an interpretation step. The F step is feelings. Any actual feelings or emotions that you have as a result of the observation. And the D, a desire step, it's a statement of desired outcome or even just desired next step. So that's an O, a T, an F, and a D. And when I have you practice this in a minute, I'm gonna put this slide back up so that you can refer to it. So let me give an example of an indirect OTFD. In an indirect OTFD, I don't name who did what, I make a general statement. So I say, let's pause. I noticed, observe step, that there seems to be an expectation that an individual can speak for an entire group. I think step. We need to resist this temptation because it's a lot to place on someone to ask them to speak for a whole community. I feel uncomfortable, feeling step. With this request, I would like us all to simply ask others to speak for themselves, desire step. Okay, so I didn't name anybody, it's indirect. Say that generally. Now here's a direct OTFD that's of the same scenario. Let's pause. I noticed, observe step, that Joe just asked Maria to speak for an entire group. I think step. We need to resist this temptation because it's a lot to place on someone to ask them to speak for a whole community. I feel uncomfortable, feeling step. With this request, I'd like us all to simply ask others to speak for themselves, desired next step. Okay? Now, some of this is just based on personality. Different people will say, oh, I'm very direct. I want to go straight. I want to point out who's doing what. Others go, oh, I would never. I would start with an indirect and just invite people into, let's think about this. Sometimes, I think it's a matter of personality. I think it's a matter of context. Sometimes I start with an indirect until if I realize the person has no idea I'm talking about them, right? Don't have a clue. So then I have to get a little more like, Joe, I noticed you just interrupted Maria. Because that person's not going to get the message otherwise. So this is really a choice that you can make, again, according to your own communication style, your own personality, your own context you're in. I'm going to have you all practice this. Any questions about OTFD before we do that? Do you feel like they have the basics? What we're going to do is stumble through the first OTFD because I don't assume any of you have tried this before. Maybe you have, but I don't assume you've tried this particular tool. And so it's totally low stakes. So I'm going to actually ask you to pair with somebody, and it's late, I understand. But I'm going to ask you ideally to pair with somebody that you don't normally work with, that isn't necessarily the person you know best in the room. So I'm going to give you a second to see if, move as you can, or find your way to folks. And could we get pairs? Of course, we can have some threes if needed, but would you all get into a pair with someone that you just don't know as well, and that'll give you your scenario for practice. Low stakes, low stakes, low stakes. Let me ask you all this. Who are willing to be the brave, putting themselves out there, person A's? Persons A, rather. Mark, who would be? Just raise your hand if in your pair or trio, you're like, okay, I'll go first. Yeah, okay. I see some. We need an A in every pair, so just decide, okay? So one of you will be A, and I'm going to give you a scenario. You let me know if you have any questions about the scenario. I'm going to set the timer, and I'm going to go right back to that OTFD slide. Again, stumble through it. Doesn't need to sound great. It's just, let's just practice, okay? Here's the scenario for person A. A student in your class or who comes into your campus office, a woman of color named Savannah, is obviously a very thoughtful and engaged student. However, you notice that some of your other students do not really listen closely to her ideas or look at her when she speaks in class. This has just happened again. You're in a class session where Savannah has shared what you know to be a very thoughtful comment on the material for today's class, but her classmates are showing signs they're not listening to her. What do you say and when do you say it? Person A is going to stumble through, and person B, in whatever time you have, I want you to comment, oh, I like how you this, or did you think of that? So after person A goes, person B should comment, and we're going to go back here, and go person A. And I want to ask you, I hate to break it up when people are in such excellent dialogue together. That part is so hard. I love seeing you all interacting. And I want to ask you this. Is anyone willing to share anything in debrief about what you can answer any of these questions about that OTFD practice with a partner or partners? What was easy or hard about it? How did it feel? What did you learn? Might you use it? You could choose any of those. Is anybody willing to share, just kind of experientially, any of your thoughts or feelings or insights about it? Yes, please. Jennifer.
We just commented on, it's brilliant to be using the I language because then you're not putting other people on the defensive. So I think Jake said that. And I just feel more confident just having a scheme like this because it'll help me, like Jake just mentioned, like we feel like we have to think really fast, right? And so this gives me like, no, I can slow down and I can think about like, the I, like the first two were easy and then the feeling I had to struggle with.
Yes.
And then I knew what I wanted us to do. So, it just gives me more confidence that I do have a plan.
Oh, Jennifer, thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you because I said I want to really learn how to do it.
She did say that to me before the workshop today. I was like, I will try.
To make sure that I really, I was going away and I was going to have my tools. So I'm excited. So thank you.
Yay! I was like, I will do my best. I'm so pleased, Jennifer. It helps me so much to have a tool. Again, whether it's a microaggression that I've heard before or it's one that just knocks my socks off, that I go, did that just happen? It helps me. It just helps me. Oh, what did I say? What do I think? How do I feel? I do a lot of like uncomfortable, or those kinds of things. And let me also say something just related, and then I'm going to go right to Heather. Something related to what you said, Jennifer, was about the F step being the hardest. That tends to be the hardest for any number of folks in higher ed, particularly academics, right? And so here's what Tasha, my communications scholar colleague, says. You can also obviously adapt any tool in any way that you want. Tasha always says that her students will often think she's really angry and she's just confused. Or they'll think she's something and she's really frustrated. Do you know what I mean? And so she'll do that. She'll also say her kids will go, are you OTFDing me right now again? So it does work that way. Like the kids know it all too well, right? And so I I will be honest with you, I've had women faculty on some campuses go, I can't use the F step, it is going to, in my culture, make me seem more weak because of the ways in which patriarchy is disallowing emotion, which all humans have, and feel different ways about all kinds of things that happen in our workplaces. And so it's really, I appreciate your naming that can really be a hard one. I try to push myself to do it, but I don't always do it either, depending. Heather?
Just like, you were talking about like doing the indirect or direct approach, like
Yeah.
if you name these students out like Savannah or Pat, are you picking on, you're the victim here and we're acknowledging that you're the victim, or does that make it worse? I mean, or
It might, depending, right? One of these things, it is a call on the fly, which is really hard, right? It is a call of sometimes I end up going indirect, like I notice something is happening. I'm not seeing the nonverbal engagement that every person in this room deserves, and I think that's something that every person deserves, and I feel uncomfortable with that. Can we just all start looking at each other as we speak? That's a sign of respect, and I've had to do that a lot more. We're not post-pandemic, but at this point in the pandemic, I had to do a lot of re-socialization for when someone is speaking. In my Race in the US class, where people, if they choose to share over the arc of the class, have some really sensitive stories, everyone being like, this is not, I have to remind, so we look at each other when we talk to each other, those kinds of things, right? So I appreciate the nuanced question. Yeah, sometimes I find some students just, they want to crawl under a table, they don't want to be named, and then in other cases, students feel differently. It's a tough one, isn't it, to decide, and sometimes it's the context of the class. Sometimes if you decide to address it next time, you might quietly talk with Savannah or Kat and go, I've noticed this, I want to say something about it, but I want to ask you first. So it might even, that might be appropriate. So there's not a perfect answer to that, unfortunately. Yes, and your name?
My name is Mary. We had this similar discussion, but that's what we were saying, where in the scenario it said that Shannon had done this numerous times.
Yeah.
So we didn't necessarily know, like we wanted to directly address it with her, but not necessarily in front of everybody. But if we didn't address it in front of everybody, then other people would be thinking we were letting it slide. So, blah, blah, blah.
I know, and in each of the, I wish I had a perfect answer. It really is sometimes those trade-offs. You just make a decision and you go, I'm going to talk to this student who keeps doing this. I'm going to talk to them. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, whatever else, talk to them. One idea amongst, I'm sure, many is you could then come to class next time and go, you know what, I want to really reiterate that folks' pronouns are really important, and those are their pronouns. And like me, I just have students write a name card where they put, what they like to be called. Charles John goes by CJ, and then their pronouns. And so like if it's written, that's one thing. I might just harken back to it in the next class. So, folks that are worried about it are like, she's got this. But sometimes there may be a sacrifice of folks knowing that I've got it. And this is just really sensitive, and I've got to talk to this person individually. And sometimes I'm talking to Kat or Savannah about it keeps going. I want to address it, but I want to make sure that we talk about it first. So you're naming really important nuances about this. This is the kind of thing where I feel like sometimes I practice with a colleague would have a really difficult conversation that I'm going to address. Something really entrenched, and I go, will you please role play with this with me? And it's not something that I think, I don't know, it just doesn't have to be perfect. It just doesn't have to be perfect. I think so many of us will expect perfection of ourselves or think, you know, oh no, what if I do say something wrong? And let me just say, I mean, probably all of us are gonna say something a little bit wrong at some point, or step over something that we just didn't see, or maybe, you know, use a term that we didn't know, you know, we weren't quite aware that actually we don't use that term anymore, and that's really changed, Grandma, from when you were young. You know what I mean? I mean, language changes all the time. It changes all the time, and so there's just a lot to kind of go, if it's me, if I am the one who needs to make the change, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna now practice, you know, whatever it is, and learn something new to say, and I'm gonna hold myself accountable for that, and hope that others will hold me accountable too. I'm gonna give you another couple of tools. One is called XYZ. Some people, I'm an OTFD go-to person. Some people like a solid kind of quicker XYZ. I feel X when Y because Z. For example, I feel uncomfortable when we talk about Claude when he isn't present because he doesn't have the chance to clarify or defend himself. I feel X when Y because Z. That's another in the tool belt kind of thing. There are certain people like, I don't know, OTFD seems like too much. For me, I like that structured OTFD. Others wanna, here's how I feel when this happens because of this. So that's another tool. Another tool is called AI, and it is, first, the A is for asking a clarifying question first. To help you understand what the person meant by their comment. So that's A. And then I is impact exploration. Either you ask the person to state a potential impact of the statement they just made or the behavioral microaggression or whatever it was, or you could state it yourself. And so these are very interactive, AI is, and one of the things is I have quite seriously before started with A, just asking a clarifying question, and I heard the person wrong. I did not hear them correctly, and so that's a real, oh, well, we're done here. Everything I just thought about the implication of what was just said was in fact not said. So we're done. Or if the person either, it also gives the person an opportunity to go, wait a minute. Maybe I do need to pick that up and take that back and decide I'm going to use a different word, right? Any of those kinds of things. Sometimes they'll just double, triple down, right? I mean, any of these things can happen. Any of these things. And so the impact exploration becomes, what if a member of that community was in our class because they are? In so many ways, there's so many invisible different identities that folks have that there's no way a faculty or staff member or other students would even know so often, you know, who's in the room, who has, for example, who is deeply immunocompromised during the ongoing still pandemic, or who is neurodivergent, or who is, you know, any of these, there are so many, I could go on and on about invisible identities folks hold. So you could ask, or you could have them ask, what might the impact be? And so those are some different tools. Again, I'm going to keep them in my imaginary around my wife's tool belt. I'm a little tool belt, and I mean, I don't think it's when microaggressions happen. I assume it's just, I don't think it's if, I think it's just going to be when, because they happen, because systemic racism is alive and well, and because patriarchy is, and class exploitation, and all the things. And that we all are just learning, not just St. Ben, St. John's community, not just University of Louisville, not just our entire world, certainly the entire US is grappling with so many of these questions and trying to find ways to just talk to each other without excoriating each other, without assuming that person's horrific motives and it is in fact an evil ringleader of some sort. But, you know, people, there's such dehumanization right now that one of the invitations of Microresistance is bringing people in and going, I mean, I think we can have a conversation about this. If you're willing, the person has to be willing to sit down with you and to have a conversation. So let me go to this. Of course, we've just gotten on the same page about what microaggressions are. We've discussed multiple different types. We have defined microresistance and identified some key forms. We've done a little microresistance practice. And we're going to go into a collective reflection, if you would. Would you like to help me with this? I'm going to ask you all to take a sheet and just take a minute or less to fill this out. It's something that asks you to do a collective reflection, and let me ask you this. You don't have to put your name on it. If you're willing, we're then going to speak out, just in the last minute, we're going to speak out. Anybody who is willing to share one of the sentences they completed. And then I'm going to ask if you're willing, if you would share this sheet with me. It helps me know. So what you're filling out right now would just be, again, you don't have to put your name on it. It would be one thing I learned today is I had no idea that. And I will try to. So I'm going to give you just a minute, if you would be willing to reflect on those particular questions. What I'm going to ask you all to do next before we part is one small thing. This is kind of this is designed after the Quaker model of folks speaking if they have something they would like to say. And so I'm going to make an invitation. If you would be willing to just complete one of these sentences and you want to share either something you learned, something you had no idea about, or something you're going to try to do, it's not call on anybody or anything. It's just people speaking out in whatever way they feel so led. And so I wonder if anyone would be willing to share, and you just kind of, it's called popcorn, just popcorn around if others would also be willing.
So I'm a very slow learner, and I love the OTFD. So I wonder if you could share more examples of scripts, since we didn't get a lot of time to practice that. That would just be really helpful for me.
Thank you. Yes, let's talk about that afterwards. Absolutely.
It just reminds me, you come to something like this, and you might do a good job of doing these kinds of things week 1, 2, 3. But for me, it's like, what does this look like week 14 in the class? When you know, not if the microaggression is going to happen, but the microaggression is happening, right? Like getting to the framework of admitting it happens, not when it is. And it's week 14 and you're exhausted.
And you're exhausted. It's just, it helps others understand what totally different folks took away, only if you're willing to share. Anybody else willing to complete a sentence, please?
I had no idea that microaffirmations can have such a positive impact, so I need to incorporate them more in my interactions with everyone.
Yeah, that's it. I needed more tools because I use a lot of microaffirmations, and I didn't have tools for when I'm shocked. Because as an introvert, I need more time to think, and maybe just when you're shocked, you need more time to think. And so having some tools that I can think in advance about how to use this is helpful.
Thank you. Anybody else? a burning thing they want to share, you don't have to. What about one last share if anyone is willing?
It was really helpful for me to hear the microinvalidations and the way in which we make excuses for things oftentimes, and then the way in which that can be harmful. So like, oh, but I actually know him and he's really nice and he didn't mean that. So that's an important thing that I'm gonna carry with me in the ways in which I do that, because your projected colleagues or your friends or, you know, what have you, just to think about that.
Thank you for that. I know that different people, of course, have really different experiences of the possibilities of doing any of this practice, and I just want to call each of us into that, stepping into, for those who have constantly had to step up, those are not the folks who should be doing more, but instead for all of us to take part of that fabric and be able to say, we actually want to make this a more inclusive space for every single student, every single colleague, and we're going to practice that, not as more work, but as integrated into our practice. It's a learning process. It is a practice. I want to thank every single one of you for spending your time here together today. Thank you so much.